Hey, welcome to Draft Academy. My name is Mike. In this course, I'm going to be teaching you guys everything you need to know to get started writing C++. C++ is one of the most popular programming languages around, and for good reason. It's an awesome programming language. It's actually a language that is closely related to the C programming language. In fact, C++ is essentially just like the next level of the C programming language. So if you're already familiar with the C programming language, then you're going to have no problem picking up C++. But even if you're not, C++ is a great first programming language to learn. And in this course, I'm going to teach you guys all of the core concepts for C++. We're going to start off just with the basics. We're going to, get everything set up. We'll install C++. We'll get you guys set up with the text editor, and I'll show you guys how to write your first program. Then we're going to get a little bit more advanced, so we'll start looking at things like variables, and we'll work with data. We'll even write a couple different programs and some little games. And then we're really going to get into the thick of it. We're going to learn all sorts of different programming structures, things like loops and if statements and classes and objects. It's going to be awesome. We're going to cover all of the core concepts, not just in C++, but all the core concepts for programming in general. So the knowledge you learn in this course will actually be able to carry over to potentially other programming languages as well. I'm really excited to be able to bring you guys tutorials on C++. It's an awesome language. It's super fun to develop in, and it's a good first language to learn if you're just getting into programming. So stick around for this course. You can kind of work through the videos at your own pace, and hopefully you guys can learn something about this awesome language, C++. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to get everything set up to start working with C++. So in order to start working with C++ and start writing programs and doing all that fun stuff, we actually have to do a little bit of setup. We're actually going to need two things on our computer. The first thing we're going to need is a text editor. And we're basically just going to use this text editor in order to write our C++ programs. Any text editor is going to work. Generally, you don't want to use a text editor like Microsoft Word or Google Docs. You're going to want to use just like a basic text editor. It could be something like Notepad. I'm going to show you guys a special text editor called an IDE, which stands for Integrated Development Environment. And we can use that text editor. And it's basically just an environment that's really awesome for writing C++ code. And then we're also going to need, in addition to a text editor, we're going to need a program called a compiler, specifically a C++ compiler. And this is a program that'll basically take the C++ code that we write, and it will translate it or transform it into a language that the computer is going to be able to understand. So as long as we have a text editor and we have our C++ compiler, then we're ready to start programming in C++. So I'm going to show you guys how to get all that set up. First thing we're going to do is head over to our browser. And I'm over here on this website called CodeBlocks. It's just www.codeblocks.org. And CodeBlocks is what's called an IDE. So it's an integrated development environment. It's essentially just a special environment, special text editor that can be used to write C++ code. So this is going to be exactly what we need. I'm just going to click Downloads over here. And you'll see there's a few options. One says download the binary release, download the source code. We're going to click download the binary release, and this is going to bring us to this page. You can see there's a link over here for Windows, XP, Vista, 7, 8, etc. And there's also links for Linux and Mac. Let's click on this Windows option. And over here, you'll see there's a bunch of these different options. So what we're going to do is we're going to download this one over here that says CodeBlocks 1601 MinGW Setup. And actually what's cool about this is it's going to include not only the CodeBlocks text editor, but this is also going to include that C++ compiler that I was talking about. So we can download both of those things in this one download for CodeBlocks. So this is the easiest way to do this as a beginner. So let's go ahead and download this. I'm just going to come over here and click on this link for SourceForge, and this should start downloading the file onto our computer. When CodeBlocks is finished downloading, let's go ahead and open that up. So I'm just going to head over to my downloads folder, and we can open that guy up. So you can see over here it says CodeBlocks 1601 MINGW Setup. Let's open this, and this should open up into an installer window. So let's click through this installer window, and we can just select all the default options, and this should start installing CodeBlocks on our computer. So once CodeBlocks is finished downloading, then we have everything we need on our computer to start writing in C++. And you can see over here, I just opened up CodeBlocks. And in the next tutorial, we're going to talk about how to set up your first CodeBlocks project and get started writing C++. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to get everything set up to start working with and start writing programs in C++. In order to set this up, we're actually going to need two different things. The first thing we're going to need is a text editor where we can write our C++ programs. And really for C++, you can use any text editor that you want. So a lot of people might use like something like TextEdit or maybe a different text editor. In our case, we're going to be using something called an IDE, which stands for Integrated Development Environment. And there's an IDE which is called CodeBlocks that is specially designed for writing C++ programs. So I'm going to show you guys how to download that. We're also going to need one more thing, which is going to be a C++ compiler. And basically this is just a program that takes our C++ code that we write and it translates it into a language that the computer can understand. So when we want to run our programs, when we want to execute the programs with the computer, we can use this compiler to translate the C++ that we write into computer code. So the first thing I want to do is show you guys how to get that compiler. And it's possible that if you're on Mac, you might already have it. But what we want to do is go up here to this search bar and we're just going to type in terminal. And I'm just going to click enter and this should open up the terminal. This is basically just a window or a program that we can use to interact with the computer using text commands. So down here, we want to check to see if we already have the C++ compiler installed. So you just want to type in gcc-v and just click enter. If you have GCC, which is the C compiler we're going to be using installed, then all this stuff should come up with like a version number and everything. If this doesn't come up, in other words, if it says that you don't have it, all you need to do to get this is just say xcode select -- install. And this is going to go off and install everything that we need for C++. So I'm just going to click enter. And I already have these installed, so these are like command line tools. You can see I already have them installed. But if you don't already have them installed, then this will basically just prompt you to install them. Once that installer is done running, then you can just check to make sure that you got GCC. So you can just say gcc-v and make sure that you have it. So once we have this C++ compiler installed and we've run this xcode select install command, now what we want to do is get a text editor. So like I said, we're going to be using a special text editor called CodeBlocks, but really you can use any text editor that you want. So I'm going to go down here into my browser and I'm over here on this website, codeblocks.org. And this is the website where we can download this program, CodeBlocks. I'm just going to click downloads. And over here, there's a couple options. You want to click on the option that says download the binary release. So I'm going to click this and you'll see there's this little list here. You just click on Mac OS X and this will bring us down here. So it's basically just a zip file that contains the CodeBlocks application. Over here we can download it from SourceForge. I'm just going to click this and this should redirect us to SourceForge and download the file for us. When CodeBlocks is done downloading, I'm just going to go over to my downloads folder and we'll see what we get. So we just got this zip folder. I'm just going to double click it. And you'll see over here we get the CodeBlocks application. So what you should do is take this and drag it over to your applications folder. That way OS X knows that this is an application we want to use. Then you have everything that you need to start writing C++. So in the next tutorial, we're going to set up a project in CodeBlocks. We're going to set up our first C++ file and then we're going to run it and we'll just get everything set up and ready to go. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to get your first C++ project up and running in CodeBlocks. So over here, I just opened up CodeBlocks, and this is sort of like the welcome screen that we get when we first open it. You see over here, there's a couple options. One says create new project, and that's actually what we're going to do. So before we're going to start writing our C++, I'm just going to show you guys how to get a C++ project up and running and ready to go in CodeBlocks. So let's click create new project. And this should open up this little window over here. So you'll see there's all these different options. And these are essentially just different types of C++ applications that we can create. We're going to just do the bare basics. So you want to come over here and click console application and then just click go. And we're just going to click next. And over here you'll see we can select between a couple different languages. We want to click C++. So I'm going to click next. And we're just going to give this project a title. So I'm just going to call it Draft. And you'll see down here I'm storing it inside of my desktop. If you want to change it, you can come over here and you can put it wherever you want. Let's click next, and you'll see over here we just have a bunch of options. You can just leave these as the default, and we're going to click finish. Once we click finish, then our C++ project should have been created. So over here in our little tree viewer, you'll see that we have our C++ project. And down here inside of this sources folder, we have this file main.cpp. And CPP is a file extension that stands for C++. So I'm just going to right click this and I'm just going to open it. And you'll see over here we have a bunch of code that's already been included in this file. So this is essentially just like the most basic C++ file that you can write. I mean, this is what we call like a hello world program. So you'll see down here, it's just printing out hello world onto the screen. And don't really worry too much about what this stuff up here is. Really, let's just focus on this line down here. This line is actually going to print something out for us. So if I was to come over here, and I'm actually going to come up here in my editor and I'm going to click on this build and run option. So when I click this, a window should pop up and it should basically just say like hello world. You'll see down here this little black window popped up and it says hello world. So let's just go over some basic terminology. Generally, whenever we're going to run a program in C++, we're going to build the program and then we're going to run the program. Building the program basically means that we're taking all this code over here and we're converting it down into a language that the computer can understand. So the first thing we always have to do is build the file. Then what we want to do is run the file, which basically means we're telling our computer to execute all of the instructions that we wrote in our program. And there's a bunch of different ways we can do that here in CodeBlocks. You can click this little cogwheel up here, and that'll build your program. And then you can click this play button over here. That's going to run your program. But a lot of times, if you just wrote some new code and you want to test it out, you can just click this build and run option. And for the most part in this course, we're always just going to be, whenever I say we're running the program, I'm just going to click this button and we'll build it and run it at the same time. So like I said, this is a very basic C++ file. In the next tutorial, we're going to talk about like what all this stuff is. We're going to look at writing some of our own instructions, maybe modifying these instructions, and we'll kind of dive a little bit deeper into, you know, just sort of the bare basics. But for now, we have everything set up. So we have our C++ project set up. We have our first C++ file called main.cpp, and we're ready to start programming. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about the basics of writing a C++ program. We're just going to talk generally about what programs are and how we can write them. And we're going to write a little program which is going to print out a shape onto the screen. So this is going to be pretty fun. But down here, I just have this basic program. And when I first created my C++ project in the last tutorial, we sort of got this basic program, and this was kind of given to us. And this is, you know, essentially just a very simple C++ program. So I'm going to walk you guys through essentially what we have here. We're going to talk about a couple different things, and then we'll start writing some code. So up here, we have these two lines of code. This is like hashtag include IOStream, and this one says using namescape std. Essentially, what this does is it's kind of like configuration options for our C++ file. As a beginner, like, you know, don't really worry too much about what this stuff is or what it's doing. We're going to talk more about all of this stuff later in the course, but for now, just know that you need to have it there in order for us to write our programs. Down here, we have this line. It says int main, and there's an open and close parentheses. This is actually what's called a function in C++. Again, don't worry too much about what a function is. I'm just kind of throwing out these words just so you're kind of familiar with hearing them. But essentially what this is it's a container for us to put the code inside of our C++ programs. So this function called main is a very special function because any lines of code that we put inside of here, in other words, any lines of code that we put in between these open and closed curly brackets is actually going to get executed when we run our program. So down here, I just have this thing. It says return 0. And again, don't worry too much about what this is. Just know that you need to have this in this main function. Over here, though, we have an actual line of code. So this says cout, and then it says hello world, then it says end L. And this is a basic line of code in our program. So again, any lines of code that we put in between these curly brackets for this main function is going to get executed when we run our program. So if I was to come up here and run my program, and I'm just going to click this build and run option right here, you'll see when the program runs, it prints out hello world. And you'll see this little window that opened up here. This is what we would call the console. And the console is basically just a little window that will output information. So whenever we run our C++ code, this console window is going to open up. And sometimes we can tell C++ that we want to print things out onto this console window. So if you ever hear me referring to the console, I'm just referring to this window right here. Now let's get down and start talking about programming. So again, any of the code inside this main function is going to get executed. And here we just have one line of code. So what I could actually do is I could copy this, and down below here I could say something else. So I could say just like my name, Mike. And now when I run this program, you'll see it's going to print out both of these things. So here on the first line, it prints out hello world. And then over here on the second line, it prints out Mike. And this is just sort of like basically how we could print something out to the console. And you'll see over here it says C out, and that stands for console out. And then over here you'll see we have this little line, it says end L. And this stands for end line. And basically what this means is we're ending the line where we're going to print out text. So you'll notice that we printed out hello world, and then on the next line we printed out Mike. So using these little print statements, I'm actually going to show you guys how we can write a little program that's going to draw a shape out onto the screen. So I'm actually going to go ahead and get rid of this text. And I'm just going to copy this guy here a couple times. So we'll make like 4 of these. And I'm going to print out a triangle onto the screen. So I'm just going to print a /, and then we'll do a space and a /, and I'm just going to keep doing this. And you'll see we're kind of drawing this little diagonal shape upwards. Now I'm going to use vertical bars, and we're going to go all the way down. So I'm just going to keep going like this. And down here, why don't we put some underscores, and then we'll put the last vertical bar. So you'll see over here, I'm actually writing out a bunch of instructions. And each of these instructions is telling C++ that we want to print out a different line onto the console. So now when I run my program, you'll see we're actually printing out this little triangle. So this is a very basic program, but you'll see just by using those 4 simple instructions, we were able to actually draw something out onto the screen. So let's talk about this. Essentially what's happening when we click that run button is C++ is going and it's looking inside of our program. And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to look for this main function right here. So it's going to look for this block of code, and that's basically just what a function is. It's going to look for this block of code called main, and inside of these open and close curly brackets, it's going to execute all of the instructions inside of there. And basically, when we're writing a program, all we're doing is we're just telling the computer a bunch of instructions. So we're giving the computer a bunch of instructions that we want it to carry out. So imagine that, for example, in real life, like you were using a recipe or something. A recipe is a lot like a program. A recipe has a list of instructions, and if you follow those instructions correctly, then you end up with like something delicious. That's basically what a program is. Program is just a collection of instructions that we're giving to the computer. And we can give the computer simple instructions like this, and we can do something simple like draw out a shape. But as we go through this course and we learn more and more complex instructions, and we learn how to use them together in unison with each other, we're going to be able to tell the computer to do a bunch of complex things. So the next thing I want to talk to you guys about is the order that these instructions get executed. So just like if you were following a recipe and you would start with the first instruction and you'd go down to the last instruction, the computer is going to execute these instructions in order. So it's going to start with this instruction, and basically here we're just telling the computer, or we're telling C++ that we want to print this line of text out onto the screen. So C++ is going to do this, and then once it's done with that, it's going to move on to this instruction, it's going to print this out onto the screen, etc. It's going to keep doing that. So actually, let me show you guys. If I was to get rid of this line and I was to put it up here, now you'll see when we run our program that we're going to print out a funky looking shape. So instead of this base being down at the bottom here, we're going to print it out on the top. And that's because we changed the order of the instructions. So again, all a program is it's just a set of instructions that we give to the computer. That's it. It's very simple. The more complex instructions that we can give the computer, and the more ways that we're able to combine those instructions in different ways, the more complex our programs are going to be. So as we go through this course, I'm going to be teaching you guys all sorts of more complex instructions. We're going to learn different ways to do different things, and we'll use real world examples to build little applications, and you'll end up learning a bunch along the way. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about using variables in C++. Now, a lot of times when we're writing programs in C++, we're going to be dealing with all different types of data and information. And a lot of times when we're dealing with that data and information, it can be kind of hard to keep track of. And a variable is basically just a container where we can store different pieces of information or different data values in our programs, and it makes it a lot easier for us to manage and maintain and use that data. So I'm going to show you guys an example, and I'll show you guys basically how variables are useful and how we can use them in C++. So down here, I have a very basic program that I've written out. You'll see down here, I'm basically just printing out a bunch of lines of text. It says, there once was a man named George. He was 70 years old. He liked the name George, but did not like being 70. So this is basically like my little story here. And you'll see I can run my program, and this is a valid program in C++. It basically just prints out the story, and we have all of our information. So, this is a pretty nice C++ program. It serves its purposes. But let's say that I'm looking at my story, and I'm thinking, maybe I want to change the character's name, right? So maybe I don't like the name George. Maybe I want to change it to a different name. So what I could do is I could go through and I could manually change it in each line of code. So I could come here where it says George, and I could change it. Let's say we want to change the character's name to John, right? So I can change it to John. I'll keep looking through the story. Down here it also says George, so I'll change it to John. And there we go. We've changed the character's name. We've officially updated it. Let's say maybe now I'm thinking to myself, I think I want to make the character a little bit younger. Instead of 70, why don't we make John 35? So I can do the same thing. I can go in and manually change the value of 70 to 35. So we can come over here and we can say he was 70. We'll change this to 35. And we'll say did not like being 70. Okay, so we'll change that to 35 as well. So now we've officially updated our story. We've changed the character's name, and we've changed the character's age. Here's the problem though. In order to make those changes, I had to manually go through and individually edit each one of the places where the character's name showed up or the character's age showed up. And imagine that instead of having a story that was only 4 lines long, I had a story that was like hundreds of lines. And we mentioned the character's name hundreds of times, and we mentioned their age hundreds of times. Well, all of a sudden, it becomes a lot more difficult for me to manage those pieces of information. So it's difficult for me to manage the character's name and the character's age. Right? If I had a story that was hundreds of lines long and we mentioned the character's name 100 times, having to go and modify and update that name would be a very tedious task because I'd have to go through and essentially just do it manually. This is where something like variables come in. A lot of times in our programs, we're going to have different pieces of information, different data values that we want to keep track of and we want to be able to manage. So what we can do is we can take those pieces of information and we can put them inside of containers called variables. And a variable, like I said, it's just a container where we can store a piece of data, and it'll make it a lot easier for us to use and manage that piece of data in our programs. So I'm going to show you guys how we could create a variable that could store the character's name and the character's age, and you'll see why this can be useful in something like this. So over here, I'm going to create a couple of variables. When we create a variable in C++, we actually have to tell C++ a couple things. The first thing we have to tell C++ is what type of information we want to store inside of the variable. Now, in the next video, I'm going to talk to you guys all about the different types of data that we can use in C++. But for now, I'm just going to show you guys 2 types of data. The first type of data that we can store inside of a variable is called a string. And that basically means it's a string of characters. So it's like plain text. So this down here where it's saying there once was a man named John, this is a string, right? It's plain text in our program. A lot of times we're going to be dealing with strings. So I'm going to create a string variable. In other words, I'm going to create a container that can store a string value. So I'm just going to say string, and that's the first thing that we have to tell C++. The next thing we have to do is give this container, give this variable a name. So what we want to do is give this a descriptive name, which will basically tell us what is inside of the variable. So I'm just going to call this character name, just like that. And what I can do now is I can give this a value. So I could say character name is equal to, and now we can type in the character's name. So I could say John, just like that. All right, so once we've created this character name value variable, now this value, John, this string value is now stored inside of this character name variable. The next thing we're gonna do is create another variable to store the character's age. In addition to storing data in the form of a string, we can also store numbers. Now, age is a whole number. So what I can do is I can store it inside of something called an integer. And an integer is basically just a whole number. So I could just say int, and I can just call this character age. Now, I want to show you guys another thing that we can do. So up here, what we did is we said string character name, and we set it equal to a value right away. But what I could also do is put a semicolon here. And also, I do want to point out, whenever we're writing lines of code in C++, every time you finish writing a line of code, you want to put in this semicolon. I'm not sure if I mentioned that in the last video, but the semicolon basically tells C that we're done with that line of code. So this separates one line of code from another. So you need to always make sure you put these semicolons. But with the variable, what I could do is I could say int character name. I could do the same thing for string. And then I could go on to a new line and I could give this a value. So I could say like character age is equal to, and now I'm just going to type in a number. So we said that John was going to be equal to 35. And you'll notice when we use numbers, we don't have to surround these with quotation marks. We just can type out the number. So now we have two variables, and I showed you two different ways that we can create them. And what we can do is we can use these variables inside of our story, and you'll see how this makes it a lot easier for us to maintain this program. So what we want to do is we want to replace every instance of the character's name and the character's age with the variable. So instead of just printing out John here, I want to refer to this variable. And the way that we need to do that is we basically need to include this variable. So over here, I'm printing out this string of text. I'm printing out a bunch of plain text, right? But let's say instead of just printing out John here as plain text, I wanted to instead print out the value that was stored inside of the character name variable. What I can do is I can just get rid of John, and I can say less than sign, less than sign. And what this is basically going to tell C++ is that we want to take the value that we're going to type out here. So I'm just going to type out character name. And it's basically telling C++ that we want to take this value and we want to insert it right here inside of this line of text. So when I go ahead and run my program now, you'll see that we're still printing out there once was a man named John, except now I didn't actually type out John. All I did was include this variable right here, and I basically just said that we want to put the variable right in there. So that's how we can include a variable inside of one of these print statements. So over here, I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to say less than character name. And now this is going to insert the character name. In other words, it's going to insert the value stored inside of the character name variable at this position. We can do the same for the age. So over here, we have the character's age. I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to say less than, and now character age. And so the value inside of the character age variable is going to get placed right in there. And we have one more place where we have the character's age. So over here, I'm going to get rid of this. And now this is going to be special. So you'll see over here, we want to insert the value inside of the character age variable right in between all of this text. So I want to put it right here. What I can do is I can make two quotation marks. And essentially what this is doing is it's saying this is going to be its own string of text, and this is going to be its own string of text. And I can make two less than signs. I can type out the character age variable. And then I'm going to make two more less than signs. And this is essentially just going to string all of these together. So it's going to say, print out this text, then print out the value inside of the character age variable, then print out this text. So I've now replaced every instance of the character's age and every instance of the character's name with those variables. Let's run our program and see what happens. Over here, you'll see we have the same exact story as we did before. There once was a man named John. He was 35 years old, John 35. So without having to manually do anything, we were able to include those values. And now what's cool about variables is if I wanted to update the character's name or update the character's age, all I have to do is change it up here in one spot. So if I wanted to change the character's name to Tom, and I wanted to make Tom, let's say 50 years old, I only have to modify the values that are getting stored in the variables, and they'll automatically update down in our story. So now when I run my program, you'll see it's using the name Tom, and it's saying that he's 50 years old. So that's kind of an awesome way that we can use these variables. Another cool thing that these variables allow us to do is modify the values. So let's say that halfway through our story, I wanted to change the character's name. Right, so halfway through, I wanted to make the name be a different name. All I have to do is say character name, and I can actually assign this a different value. So I could give this the value of Mike, and again, I'm gonna need a semicolon here at the end of this line of code. And now you'll see halfway through the story, the character's name is gonna change. So it says there once was a man named Tom, and down here it's using the name Mike. So not only was I able to just use those variables to insert these values, but I can actually modify those variables at different places in my program. So that's pretty awesome. Now, this is just sort of like the bare basics of variables. Variables are containers. They allow us to maintain and keep track of the data and the values in our programs a lot better. And they also give us the advantage of only having to assign a value once. So I can assign a value once up here, and then I can use it and refer to it at different places down here. I can also modify those values at different places in my programs. So in this tutorial, we talked about storing values as strings of text and as integers, which are whole numbers. In the next tutorial, I'm going to show you guys all of the different types of information and the different types of variables that we can create in our programs. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about the different data types in C++. And what data type basically just means a type of data or a type of information that we can use and work with inside of our C++ programs. So there's all different types of information. We can store like text, different types of numbers, decimal numbers, true, false values, all sorts of stuff. And I'm going to kind of walk you guys through what all of those are and how we can use them. So the easiest way for me to demonstrate this is just going to be to create a bunch of different variables. So any of the different types of data that we can work with in C++, we can actually store inside of variables. So I'm just going to create a couple different variables, and I'll kind of show you guys exactly how this is going to work. So the first data type I want to talk to you guys about is called a character. And a character basically allows us to represent one single character. So the way we can create a character variable is just by saying char, and now I want to give this a name. So let's just call it like grade or something. And whenever we create a character, we're going to use these single quotation marks. So I can store any like regular character that I would want inside of here. So, you know, essentially any character that you can think of, you could store in here, and then we're going to include this semicolon. So that's basically like the character data type. And in addition to just storing one single character, there's going to be a lot of situations where we're going to want to store like more than one. And what we can actually do is use something called a string. And a string is basically just a string of characters. So it's, instead of just being one single character, it's like a bunch of different characters. So this would be like essentially just plain text that we would see in a program. So I could just say string, and we could just call this like phrase. And when I create a string, I can use these double quotation marks. So I could say like Draft Academy or something. And now we're going to be able to store, instead of just one character, a bunch of different characters. So there's different situations where you might want to use either like a char or a string. But for the most part, I think strings are probably a little bit more commonly used than chars. So instead of just plain text, we can also store and work with numbers. So essentially there's two different types of numbers, or two basic types of numbers. There's whole numbers, and then there's decimal numbers. Some people will also call those floating point numbers. A whole number is like a counting number. So think like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? They're just whole numbers, solid numbers. There's no decimal points, right? Then we have decimal numbers. So it'd be like 0.5 or 1.267 or 10.11. Basically a number that has a decimal point after it. When we work with these different numbers, C++ is actually going to distinguish between them. So the first type of number we can work with is an integer. So I could just say int, and this could be like an age or something. So whenever we're creating a number, we can just type out the number. So I could say like 50. And you'll notice I don't need any quotation marks. I don't need anything special surrounding this. I can just type out the number. In addition to positive numbers, you can also use negative numbers. But anytime we're using an integer, you can't have a decimal point. So you can't do anything with decimals. These are just going to be solid whole numbers. If you want to work with a decimal, you have two basic options. So there's two data types that represent decimals in our programs. The first is called float, and this basically just stands for like floating point number. The second one is called double. Now you'll hear different people talk about these different data types. The main difference is just how many decimal points they can store. So a double can store more decimal points than a float. So if you need a number to be very specific as far as like how many decimal points you can take it to, then you definitely want to use a double. And I would say for the most part as a beginner, just only worry about doubles. Floats will be used more in specific circumstances, but as you're just learning this language, really just worry about doubles. So we could just say double like GPA, and I could set this equal to like 4.5 or like 2.3. Basically, I could make this any decimal number that I wanted. Keep in mind, you could also do like 2.0, so it doesn't have to be like a different number decimal. And again, you can make these negative, that's no problem. So ints are going to be what we're going to use for whole numbers. For the most part, doubles are going to be what we're going to use for decimal numbers. So that covers text and numbers. And just with those two data types, with text, we can use characters and strings, and then ints and doubles, you can represent like just about any type of information in your programs. But C++ is awesome, so they're actually going to give us another data type, which is called a Boolean. And a Boolean is maybe not as intuitive as like text and numbers. A Boolean is actually what we would call a true-false value. So when we're writing our programs, there's actually going to be a lot of situations and circumstances where we want to represent true or false data. And a Boolean is just a special word for true or false, right? So I could say BOOL, that stands for Boolean, and we could create a variable like isMale, right? So this variable isMale is going to store a true or a false value inside of it. And this will basically tell us whether or not someone is male. So in my case, I could say true because I am a male, right? So you'll see how this can kind of come in handy for different things. Like we could say something is true, or we could say something is false, and that allows us to represent a certain type of information. I could also say false over here, and that's going to be the opposite. So these are going to come in handy a lot, these true, false values, and we can use Booleans to represent them. So for the most part, these are the basic data types. Now there's a couple other data types that we could also get into, but I think 99% of the time as a beginner, as somebody who's learning C++, don't concern yourself with anything that you don't have to. So Booleans, doubles, which are just decimal numbers, ints, which are whole numbers, strings, which is plain text, and chars, which are just single characters. That's what we're going to be working with. So as we go forward in the course, we're going to be working with all this different type of information. Now, I want to point out one more thing. So I'm actually just going to make a little print statement here. And, this is a basic statement. So if I wanted to, I could print out any one of these variables. Like if I could print out grade, for example, and this is going to go ahead and print that out onto the screen. You'll see over here, we're just printing out A. But we don't have to store this information inside of variables. So if I wanted, I could just type in a string down here, right? I don't have to store it in a variable, and this is what we would call a constant. So I don't need to store it inside of a variable. I could also, type out like false, or I could type out a number like 4.5, or I could type out an integer, or I could type out a character. Like, you don't have to put these things inside of variables. A lot of times you can just use like straight up like that. And this is what we would call a constant. But a lot of times you're going to want to store information in variables because it's really useful. And obviously when you do that, you have to declare the data type, and you have to tell C++ what type of data you want to work with. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about the ins and outs of working with strings in C++. Now, in the C++ programming language, one of the most common types of data that you're going to be working with are going to be strings. And strings are basically just plain text. So any type of plain text that we want to represent or work with in our program is going to be considered a string. So down here, you'll see I have this little program set up, basically just printing out a couple lines. So the way I can create a string is just by using an open and closed quotation marks like this. So I can basically type out whatever I want. If I wanted to, I could type out Draft Academy. You'll see now I'm printing out Draft Academy and hello. If I was to run my program, you'll see that we print out Draft Academy and hello. First thing I want to show you guys is has to do with this cout line of code over here. So you'll notice here it says end L right here. And basically when we put end L right there, it tells C++ that we want to print a new line after we print whatever is in here. So if I was to get rid of this and I just said cout Draft Academy, now what you'll see is that hello is going to get printed on the same line as Draft Academy because we didn't put end L, so we didn't put a new line. If I wanted to, though, I could actually manually come in here and specify a new line by saying a \n. So \n basically means that we want to print out a new line. So this inside of a string represents the new line character. So now when I run this program, you'll see that hello gets printed out on a new line. So that's how we can use that \n inside of our string in order to do essentially the same